Good evening, everyone. I'll call this meeting of the Budget Committee to order. Mrs. Donaldson, would you call the roll, please?
Deacon.
Here.
Fitzwater. Hensley.
Present.
Kimna.
Here.
Lester.
Here.
Schreiber. Spencer.
Here.
Spicer. Ward. Here. Wiseman.
Present.
Great, thank you. As we begin committee discussion tonight, I wonder if Mrs. Perry might report back to the committee on the topic of general sales tax projections.
So I commented at the last budget committee meeting that we had gotten another month's worth of sales tax collections in for the general fund. I did go back and take a look and see if there's any more room for movement there based on the budget that we have currently in the general revenue. At this point, the city administrator and I have talked, and the $13.5 million that we have in the general fund really seems to be an accurate depiction of what we can anticipate at this point. The last month that we collected was slightly above revenue projections, but it's still probably not enough to make any movement in the budget figure.
Great. I appreciate you taking another look at that. Totally understand the answer, but it's worth another one more shot, especially with the new information. Does anyone have questions or comments on those on that topic? Seeing none, speaking of the $13.5 million, there was also discussion at our last meeting about making our estimates as to the capital improvement sales tax and our public safety tax uniform based on the general sales tax projections, which would result in increased projections in both sales tax H and the public safety tax. Is that correct?
So I did go back after I reviewed the general fund, and per the request of council, I made the modification on both the sales tax H parking lot and the public safety parking lot. Sales tax H, if we base both of these figures on the base number that we're using for the general revenue of $13.5 million, the additional capital improvement tax revenue that would go into the capital improvement budget would be $1,150,000. Again, same base, 13.5, and it's 0.5% compared to the 1% in the general fund. And then on the public safety tax, that would result in an additional $575,000. Again, same base at 0.25% based on the tax rate.
Great, thank you very much. Let's open up some discussion on this point. Anyone have comments or questions about these calculations and about potentially adopting these changes for our projections with respect to sales tax H and the public safety tax? Councilman Lester?
I just move that we adopt those as our projections.
Okay, there's been a motion to adopt these revised projections. Is there a second?
A second.
There's a second from Councilman Kemna. So now we'll have additional discussion on this if there is any to be had. I think this makes all the sense in the world. I appreciate you all taking another look at this and council's consideration of it. Any other discussion on this point? Seeing none. Mrs. Donaldson, would you call the roll, please?
Deacon.
Aye.
Fitzwater. Hensley.
Aye.
Kimna.
Aye.
Lester.
Aye.
Schreiber.
Aye.
Spencer.
Aye.
Spicer. Ward. Aye. Wiseman.
Aye.
Okay, the ayes have it. We have adopted these revised revenue projections. And now we have time for additional committee discussion on other points. Does anyone have anything to raise at this point?
So
Councilman Lester?
yes, I'll just say last week I detailed a lot of different items, and I'm not going to bring those up this meeting. I want to reassess that and hopefully get together with the chairman and see if we can have some commonality of view, and we may not, but we'll see before our next meeting, and I may bring it up then. I did want to, I had also suggested some things for the parking lot, and I wanted to go ahead and vote on those, since if we don't, they'll drop off. And of course, some of them may not make it on, but I can bring them back up, I guess, if I want to. Those were the sergeant to monitor body and car cam systems funded through the safety tax. And I guess we would need to do these one at a time, or what? I mean, I could.
I think we probably do, unless you're pretty confident in your slate, but we can take them one at a time.
I don't.
We can do it one at a time, sure.
Okay. Maybe we'll do them we'll do them by funding source, I guess. So that'd be the one thing from safety tax. And so, we've had that discussion. I think that position and tracking and monitoring, keeping up with that, just goes with getting the body and car cams. It's necessary and part of the package in my view, and I think the public's view.
I'd agree, and I've commented before that while it is, of course, a staff position, I see it as part and parcel of the overall system, as you were saying. So, and this proposal also goes along with, I believe it was this, was it sales tax G?
Where the
Funding
sales-
for the cams
for the cams.
that you'd
Correct.
also proposed, which made some room in public safety tax available funding. So, so that's some context. Councilman Spencer?
Do we have any anticipated timeline of when we would be purchasing those cams? Are we anywhere closer to getting that?
I think we have all of the background stuff with policies and things like that. We're getting those all put together, but it was my understanding that we would just have to get the bids put back out, or updated bids, and make the purchase then, as soon as a funding source was identified.
Is that anticipated still for this budget year, or are we gonna maybe hold off till the next budget year?
It was my understanding we were gonna just wait until the funding source was identified, and then we would hit the ground running from there to get everything
that-
put in motion.
And that funding source is still a possibility of grants yet?
Yes,
Right.
yes, we have not heard about the federal grants as of yet.
You have, and you probably just don't have a good feel for when that might be awarded, if it is awarded to.
Yeah, I thought November 1st was, or early November was when it was anticipated. Is that correct or not? For that grant?
I'm not really sure of the exact date when it was supposed to be awarded.
I would suggest that this position would be tied into the implementation of those cameras. And, we could, that way we're not paying for something just yet until it's fully in service and implemented with the purchasing of the cameras and hardware.
So is your suggestion then to hold off and then pursue a supplemental for the cam sergeant position?
I'm fine with making sure we have identified those funds within the public safety tax. That's fine. But maybe we just don't, basically write the check for it just yet until we, get those.
Yeah, I know, this has been a priority item for a while. And I don't sense that there's gonna be any hesitation or dragged feet once the funding is lined up. And if we passed it tonight or sometime in the very near future, I would think that police could then get to work trying to find the best qualified candidate, and that person would be ideally on the ground here when the cams were deployed or arrived, and then as they were being deployed. Is that fair?
I would say that'd be ideal, is to have the person in place prior to, because there is some background work to be done also, and just the implementation of it of the cameras and the installation, because it's including the in-car cameras also. So there's a little bit of legwork behind the scenes that would have to be done before they're going to be out on the streets. But it shouldn't take long once we receive them to get them passed out. We just want to make sure that we don't get behind on the quality control of those either prior to getting them out on the street.
I would be fine then if we want to earmark that, and I was just trying to potentially have some vacancy savings as much as we could, but probably in the grand scheme of things, we only be looking at a month or two at the most anyway, but every little bit helps. So.
Right, absolutely. Any, Councilwoman Wiseman?
Yeah, well, so have we, I know this is a different topic, but have we identified a funding source for the public safety Juneteenth holiday and health dental increases? Because I hate to tag something else onto the public safety tax when we don't quite have a funding source for this, and it looks like we're still 180 short in the general fund.
Yeah, so
It has not been identified. The current parking lot sits to remove those from the public safety tax and to move them to the general fund, but there's been no funding source identified from the general fund.
And could someone remind us why the discussion is even occurring with respect to public safety tax fund and these two items? Because people may not be aware of, for instance, what the actual cost of the holiday, the additional holiday is.
Those two items were put into the mayor's budget for FY23. I know that when council voted on the approval of that in 22, I think it was a discussion at that point that it not come out of public safety tax. Her budget did reflect that for 23, and it was an increase for the cost of the additional Juneteenth holiday, which the only cost that we have as a city relates to public safety workers. And then the health and dental increase was just for public safety workers, and it would be the increase on health and dental as projected for the FY23 budget.
So the additional holiday cost is personnel services time, overtime,
Correct.
essentially for just for public
Strictly
safety.
related to public safety, yes.
and I would like later on to have a discussion about public safety tax and our concept of expenditures from that safety tax.
Okay, so we have a motion on the table with a second. We've had some additional discussion, and again, the motion relates to the camera sergeant position for police. Is there additional conversation on that motion? Seeing none, Mrs. Donaldson, would you call the roll, please?
Fitzwater, Hensley.
Aye.
Kimna.
Aye.
Lester.
Aye.
Schreiber.
Aye.
Spencer.
Aye.
Spicer. Ward.
Aye.
Wiseman.
No.
Deacon.
Aye.
Is that seven?
Motion passes. Yep.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Additional conversation points from members of the committee.
So the other items that I put on the parking lot that had been in the original, in the mayor's proposal, out of sales tax G, one was a central maintenance vehicle, and then two public works street vehicles. These were high priority pink slip items, and actually more vehicles than what a requested out of G were requested. But anyway, those had been taken out. I'm proposing that they be put back in on out of sales tax G, remaining gleaning funds.
Okay, so I think the only remaining funding in sales tax G was somewhere around I think it's just somewhere short of 1.5 million that we had sort of set aside as some sort of strategic reserve, though we didn't move it or do anything to it. That's just sort of approach-wise where we landed a couple of weeks ago. So what would be the total cost? Is it those three items?
It's
only-
$206,000.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, personally, I'm not saying that we won't eventually possibly take it from there. I just think that we're such a short time past when we agreed to try to take a beat and think about things strategically, that I'm personally not real comfortable going back and opening that up again at this point. And I can imagine what one of our absent colleagues would say, but I can't speak for for him. Is there any other comments on this point, Councilman Kemna?
Well, it's also my understanding too, like, as you alluded to, it may eventually come from there, but with the allocation of sales tax, that's not necessarily something we have to, address tonight. We can always bring that up at a council meeting later, from my understanding, if we're gonna use sales tax G on additional, vehicles or whatnot. So I don't necessarily see the urgency in doing that right now, like you said, and we can always come back to that.
That's fair. Other discussion? So is that a motion? No, I'm sorry, they're already on the board. And do we require a second before we vote on these things? We normally do, right? Okay. So I assume you're moving now for the adoption of this change?
I am, and we'll see.
Okay, so the motion has been made to make these purchases out of sales tax G gleaning funds. Is there a second?
I'll make a second on that. I think that in conversations with staff and Public Works, I think that they feel that these are fairly critical based on the problems they've had with some of their trucks and everything. So I know, bad weather's headed this way, so I'll make a second.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. Additional conversation.
Yeah, I just will remind, when Director Marash talked about those vehicles, they're quite old, many miles on them, and with the wear and tear, there's a need for replacement. Of course, there's more than these vehicles, but these are the ones that are most in need of replacing.
Mm-hmm. Councilman Spencer.
Mr. Smith, if you can answer a question. So if we identified a funding source for these vehicles, what would be a best case scenario of when these would be delivered in our fleet?
I'll do my best to use a crystal ball, but if we were to get them ordered early in the cycle, we would most probably get them in the summer, the following summer. But if we miss that ordering cycle, so in other words, what I was trying to say is, if you tell me in January that we have the money, I don't think I would get them for another year and a half.
And I guess we're missing that window already. And once I think the supply chain issues get better, that might, a wait and see approach might benefit us a little bit more, possibly. But I'm not an expert in that field, so I'd rely on you and your crystal ball.
Yeah, the Ford ordering, we should be, if we had the money on November 1, we should be able to get them, ordered and hopefully get them within that model year. But if it's much past the beginning of November, that would be probably not going to happen.
Councilman Schreiber.
In my discussions with Mr. Marash, I think that the year to 18 months was what was projected, but based on the fact that you've probably got a lot of other agencies, and I know of some that are in the same situation where they're trying to place orders, to me, the sooner we get the order in and get on the list, if it takes that long, then we have no idea how long it might take if we continue to wait. So to me, it'd be a good idea if we got our order in, So at least it's in the works. So that's my thinking on it.
Other discussion on the motion? Councilman Spencer?
Just a point of clarification, the street sweeper is still in place in the mayor's budget, or was that in someone?
There is one street sweeper in the
One.
budget, in the mayor's, out of sales tax.
Okay. What's the timeline of that piece of equipment?
Probably a year.
Same,
Yeah,
same type scenario?
yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Other discussion on this point? Yeah, I'll just reiterate, my discomfort with this right now is simply a matter of timing. It's not any indication about, whether I think that these are needed items. And I think that, we'll have time to come back and revisit this in the not too distant future, when we have a fuller, clearer picture of exactly where we are on all of our budgeting items. So that's just where I am tonight. Other discussion on this point? Seeing none, Mrs. Donaldson, call the roll, please.
Hensley,
Nay.
Kimna.
No.
Lester,
Aye.
Schreiber,
Aye.
Spencer,
No.
Spicer, Ward,
No.
Wiseman.
No.
Deacon,
No.
Fitzwater. 6
Okay.
noes.
The noes have taken it tonight. Okay, additional topics of discussion.
Okay, and I had one other item I'd put on, which was to fund the 2 human resources laptops so they can do their work more efficiently. I requested those to be funded out of ARPA. The cost was $3,500.
What is,
Councilman Kamina?
no, what is our current funding in ARPA right now?
It's definitely under 100. I want to say somewhere between 45 and 75, but I can't quite remember.
Before the items were added to the general fund parking lot that are at the bottom, there was, I believe, $455,000 left. Shelby, can you tell me the total on the ARPA items there? Excluding that. So 455, I believe, is what we started with, and 384 and some changes what's up on the parking lot. So you're right, probably less than 100.
Okay. Somewhere around 70-ish, seems like.
Yes.
Okay. That answers your question, Councilman Kamina.
Absolutely.
An important one. Okay, is there comments, discussion on this particular item? Councilman Lester, is that a motion that you're making?
Yes.
Okay, the motion to purchase those 2 HR laptops using remaining ARPA funds has been made. Is there a second?
I'll second that.
Okay, there's a motion and a second. Is there additional discussion?
No, again, I just think our staff need the tools to do their work most efficiently, and I think these would help with that, or justified.
Okay, thank you. Any further discussion? Councilwoman Ward.
I know Gail's not here this evening, but can you share a little bit more information on why those were requested? And
from my understanding, those were some laptops that would allow the employees to work from home and be able to connect to our system
and currently we don't
when
have.
needed. I mean, you know, like during the pandemic or if we're
Right,
doing some
right.
work.
And we currently have no laptops that will
Well,
have
I don't
that.
know about.
I believe we have some loaner laptops that we will allow kind of to be checked out, for lack of a better term.
And I think they also have to be, I'm going to use the word synchronized for their home.
And would these be a replacement of a desktop that is needing replaced? Because I know the university has gone to we don't use desktops anymore. When we need a new computer, we automatically get a laptop, so it is mobile and we can use it.
Yeah, that's what I
whereas-
use. I use a laptop and a docking station, but the
Right,
answer to
right.
your question is no, this would be in addition to.
Have
We
looked
have a
into
replacement schedule for all computers here in the building.
to be
And
laptops?
if it was requested from the department director at the time they were to be replaced, we would consider that.
There was a configuration issue with at least one of the two employees, meaning they needed to have something done that would allow them to work from home, specific to that, which is putting it on that laptop machine was easier,
Right.
but.
So to kind of tag team off of that, what Councilman Ward was saying, so if we have loaners available, that could suffice for this purpose, that,
I'm unsure of what it is that the intention was, but I do know that we have loaners that we can make available, and I know those have been made available to, for example, I have someone in my office that was out for an extended period, and we used a loaner because they're accustomed to working with a desktop unit.
I mean, I think unless we had a change of strategy with staffing and hours and those kinds of things, that this would get us through that season of need, so,
Yeah, unless there's more than a few employees that need to work from home for whatever
Right.
that particular reason is, like
right,
tornado or something. But that's, kind of the answer.
thank you.
We could try it. I mean, it's a big issue.
Okay, further discussion on the motion related to these two HR laptops. Seeing none, Mrs. Donaldson, call the roll, please.
Kimna,
Aye.
Lester,
Aye.
Schreiber,
Aye.
Spencer,
No.
Spicer, Ward,
Aye.
Wiseman,
Aye.
Deacon,
No.
Fitzwater, Hensley.
Aye.
Ayes have it. Motion passes.
Okay, we have bought some laptops. Okay, other items of discussion brought by the committee. Councilman Spencer.
Councilman Schreiber and I have been discussing some issues that we've had in Public Works, and if there was a way we could put this on the parking lot from ARPA funds. We have a couple cemeteries that are in need of some major repairs. So I'd like to put $30,000 on those two cemeteries to address the fencing and some property cleanup and maintenance issues for both. It's two cemeteries, correct, Councilman Schreiber?
Basically, Longview, which is still active, so we had some complaints, and I don't
Yeah.
know if y'all want to look at that. Maybe it's needed to
And,
Yeah.
and the one on the west end, which cemetery is?
That's Longview,
That's Longview.
that is it, the others are on McCarty Street.
Okay.
Yeah.
I believe, wasn't this brought up at a previous council meeting not too long ago on these fencing? There, someone.
Public
addressed-
Works.
Public
brought up at
Works.
Public Works
okay.
meeting, and that's when I initiated for us to go out and look at it, and Mr. Sanders is aware of it as well, and this has been an ongoing problem for a number of years, going back to the time when I was the chair of the cemetery committee for the city. So it's nothing new. And since that's still an active cemetery, and there are houses right there in this particular area, then I would say that we certainly need to take some action at some point.
Okay, and I assume that maintenance of this property is an allowed use of the ARPA dollars. Is that right? I just making sure that maintenance of this property would be an allowed use of.
Yeah, general governmental expenditure.
Is there other discussion on this proposal? Councilman Lester?
My only question is the amount, how did we arrive at that? Do we know what's needed?
Based on what I've seen, it's a lot of maintenance cleanup and fencing repair. and it's just mainly a placeholder of an estimate that, basically off the top of my head.
No, I've been out there and seen it. Yeah, the fencing, and I just, don't know how it corresponds to what the need is. But
Councilwoman Wiseman?
If this hasn't been seconded for voting already, I would like to second it for voting this evening, since it seems we've identified a funding source.
Okay, fair enough. We have a motion and a second. Councilman Kemna?
And as far as a placeholder, is it gonna be 15-15, the placeholder? Is that the idea, or is it just as needed between the two?
15-15.
Sure, okay. Just wanted to see how it was earmarked.
Okay, so other discussion on the motion that has a second? Okay, seeing none, Mrs. Donaldson, please call the roll.
Lester,
aye.
Schreiber.
Aye.
Spencer,
Aye.
Spicer, Ward,
Aye.
Wiseman.
Aye.
Deacon,
Aye.
Fitzwater, Hensley.
Aye.
Kimna.
Aye.
Motion passes.
Okay. Probably gets us down below $40,000 in the ARPA fund. That's good to keep track. So, other discussion tonight, other topics of discussion. Councilman Lester?
Yeah, I wanted to discuss the safety tax and see if we can talk about the intended use of safety tax funds and see if we can, as a council, agree on conceptual framework for that. So I put up, you can see on the screen, and this was from FOP presentations before the safety tax was even put out there. And this was from a couple of their slides, addressing retention, loss of officers and retention of current officers, and what some of the major problems were. And you can see some of those were benefits and equipment and technology, and of course pay for officers and benefits. And then I've also put up there, I talked with Detective Bowman about this, and I went to a number of the presentations by the FOP and the fire, and I know Councilman Hensley did also. And I think everyone I went to, they emphasized that this was for salaries and benefits and equipment and other needs that would support and improve safety. And it wasn't for any one particular thing. And I think certainly starting out, we don't want to limit ourselves in terms of how we focus necessarily. Yes, right now salaries are the main thing, but to me, salaries always go along with benefits. The benefits are part of the package, and so I don't ascribe to there being separation there for those benefits that go around along with salary. But like I said, I think with public safety tax and their expenditure from those funds, we need to just keep our minds open as far as what that is intended for, and use it as it's needed, and also not to separate out benefits away from salary, because I think it's all part of the package that goes along with having quality staff and attracting and retaining those firemen and officers.
Councilman Spencer?
Just in response to that, Councilman Lester, I just want to make clear, though, that previous councils, previous mayors, previous city administrators, and I'm not going to lump this current city administrator with those groups, or even really this current council, because when we transitioned into loggers, we had a large amount of, I guess you'd call it unfunded liability. And for many, many, many years, these councils, previous councils and mayors and city administrators did not fund the firefighters' pension plan like they should have. And so I do not want to see that burden placed on this current generation of firefighters. And quite frankly, if the public safety tax wouldn't have passed, we would still be having these challenges of funding, trying to find funding for benefits and pay. And I think pay is our number one focus. And until we get a clear lay of the land, if you will, of how this public safety tax funding comes in, and how and for sure how the allocation of both these work agreement contracts are implemented, I would like to hold off on some of that. Again, because it's not fair for these current firefighters to have to carry that burden of funding the pension plan, or the majority of the pension plan, off the public safety tax. If you really look at the numbers, it's a wide gap between the FOP and the firefighters. So I'm not saying that there might not be a little bit of room there. I'm not negotiating either way. So, but the philosophy is that I don't think that that's wise at this time.
Our FOP pension, our current FOP pension liabilities funded out of the public safety tax, along with the new, along with the pay increase?
Yes.
That would also be funded
But
through the,
just on the pay increase.
right.
Which is
The general fund is still maintaining what they had previously been paying.
Okay. And I'm trying to make sure that we don't go beyond where we should be having public conversation on something that I think is still sort of a closed matter. But that's, Councilman Lester?
And so I'm probably saying that because I think any of the basic benefits that go with positions, should be funded. And so I am talking about the health and dental that was just connected to the increases. And to me, that's appropriate to come out of safety tax and not be put back on the general fund. But, so that's one of the things I'm saying. But just, when you're doing salaries and you're increasing salaries, then the basic benefits that go along with those salaries and those positions should be funded.
Okay, thank you for those comments. Any other discussion on this topic for now? I suspect we'll come back to it, but let's see, we have to check 3 clocks to make sure we have 50 minutes left in our normal scheduled time. So probably a good idea to get into the Edmond chargeback discussion, which was brought up during our last meeting, in which staff has been kind to put together information for us and may be able to report back some comments and maybe some short-term suggestions in this regard. So can we get some follow-up on the Edmond chargeback topic, please?
Ken, provided you all a worksheet essentially of how the admin fees are calculated by department. Ms. Perry can go through the specifics of that if you're interested in that. So I think that was one of the questions. And the other question I think council asked was, could we find any documentation of prior council approval of the administrative charge implementation? The answer to that is Ms. Donaldson couldn't, Ms. Perry couldn't, and I couldn't find any such approval by a city council of the admin fee. So doesn't mean it may not be out there. We just couldn't find it, and we've been looking for quite some time. So I don't know if there are any other questions. And if you want to get into the details, Ms. Perry's prepared to do that.
Yeah, I wonder if we could get sort of a 30,000-foot reminder generally of just how it's calculated across the affected departments.
General.
So essentially, we look at the most recent audited financial statements, and we come up with a percentage by fund of the total operating expenditures. That percentage is then used to allocate the expenses for administrative departments, and all funds are charged that allocation, with the exception of the fact that the general fund does not charge itself. So that's a 30,000-foot view.
Because even though administratively the city's organized into departments based on the task performed or the responsibilities of the departments, when it comes to budgeting and planning for spending, it's done on a fund basis.
Fund by fund, correct.
Right. So when we're talking about these services, these are sort of centralized services that are performed not only for the general fund departments, but also for the enterprise fund
And parks is a
operations
special revenue.
and for parks.
Yes.
Yeah. And it's simply to get back to even, right?
Yes.
It's to recoup the cost of services provided
Uh,
to those other funds, because those other funds that have dedicated revenues from various sources should also, and I don't know that anyone disagrees with this, should also be expected to pay for sort of the back office administrative help that allows them to perform their operations. Is that basically the rationale of
Yes,
the
and
process?
we do have 2 enterprise funds that the general fund subsidizes. Even though the general fund subsidizes, we still do allocate the expenses to both airport and transit. The general fund subsidizes those, so whatever that expense is, we provide in a subsidy.
Could I just add that the practice and the manner, the formula, if you will, was established in 2006, I believe?
2006 was the first budget year that administrative chargebacks show up.
And we've been, I wasn't here, I didn't have anything to do with the establishment of that particular formula. But I think we've been using that formula throughout. And perhaps maybe we have outgrown that particular methodology of doing that. I don't know.
And I believe that the city administrator also provided the Gfoa best practices for administrative charges. What that specifies is that it's recommended that you do charge other funds for the administrative services. There is no recommendation on how that allocation should happen, with the exception of the fact that it should be consistent and it should have a methodology behind it, which ours does. And it is the same methodology that's been used since the inception.
Mr. Kroll?
Could I just add to that? I think, is Parks here? That change probably happened when the parks from property tax to sales tax happened, which, would have made sense that that's when it would have occurred. I don't know.
Okay, so the enterprise funds, not parks, but the enterprise funds are charged in one way. And then parks is charged in a different way. And one of the bits of information that we weren't able to find was an explanation as to why. Is that right?
I couldn't find council's, any formal adoption by the city council of that particular reason. I don't know if Parks has any additional information. Doesn't mean that there was any. I just couldn't find any formal adoption of that difference.
And to go back to a point you had a moment ago about the general fund not charging itself basically for general fund departments. Essentially the taxes collected through the general sales tax are to cover the general operations, I suppose, of city government, being the operations that are not covered by sort of these special funds.
General fund revenues are intended to cover the operations of the general government, yes.
Yeah. So if the general fund charged itself $1 million for what it cost to provide the police department, for instance, I don't know if that number is close or not, but if it cost $1 million to provide back office support to the police department, and the general fund charged the police department budget by $1 million for that chargeback, the police department would suddenly have $1 million hole, and the general fund would have $1 million extra. And
Correct.
I wonder how we would go about trying to fill the hole
Oh,
in the police budget. I'm guessing it's probably with the $1 million extra that are sitting in the general fund.
So could we charge the general fund for the services we provide to the general fund? Yes. There would be, in your example, $1 million worth of extra expenditures put into the budget. But at the same time, there would also be $1 million worth of offsetting revenue put into the budget as well. So it has a net effect of 0.
A really fun but meaningless
You said that, I didn't.
accounting exercise.
You said that, I did not.
Absolutely. But it wouldn't have the effect that it has with the other funds, which is the recouping of dollars spent providing services and the evening out of the cost of providing those services, right?
Correct, because you're recouping it from yourself, from the general fund.
I'm just going to add that, and there are firms that have expertise in calculating those kinds of things, and they come in and look at all the expenditures and all the different kinds of things going on. Different firms do it in different ways, and they have different methods, different formulas they come up. So there are firms that have expertise in that, if that's something that council was interested in doing, having a firm do that.
Is there discussion by the committee on this point? Whose hands up? Councilwoman Wiseman.
How much would that cost?
I don't know. When I've done it in cities before, and it depends on obviously the scope. But I mean, it's probably, I'd say, $30,000-ish thing. You think more than that?
I think
40?
more than that.
It depends if it's a firm. Okay.
I think the very first time you have a firm come in and do that, it would be much more than that. It is recommended by Gfoa best practices that be reviewed every 3 years. We are reviewing what we're doing on an annual basis. You get a different number every year from us. But I think the methodology itself, first time it's probably going to be pricey.
Councilman Spencer.
My question would be to Mr. Spalding. Have you ever found any documentation on the admin fee and how it was derived? And
All I've found is the process with the former Mayor John Landwehr, who was involved in getting the dedicated park sales tax. Have had conversations with Bernie Fechtel and Mike Kehoe, who was in charge of the dedicated park sales tax at the time, as well as the former director Lockwood. Is when they got together, when we, the park department, when they went after this dedicated park sales tax, there were basically multiple phases to it. First was they would the parks would remove their subsidy from the general fund, which was $1.2 million at the time. And in that, removal of that general fund subsidy, and this is listed in the 2006 budget book by the city, that there would be 6 new firefighters, 6 new policemen at that time. So that's the first part. Second part would be that they would remove themselves from the property tax, which was a savings of over $1 million as well. And in response, they would pay, since this was a new fund and a special revenue fund, like we have other funds, that they would try to calculate what they felt like was a close cost of what it would cost to run this separate fund. And that's where they came up with, at the time, was $200,000 and some thousand. And what they did after talking with them, they tied that with the sales tax fund, and I think rightly so they could escalate a little bit every year for the city's general fund. So they did the research then. There wasn't any council approval that I can find either, or commission approval, but they did that as a kind of an operational thing, as a staff level sort of thing, and that's where they'd come up with it. Correct.
Councilman McKemna.
And I think too, just maybe that next year, parks had reduced the amount that they were receiving in the sales tax, G&H, that was also passed.
That was a phase that I forgot to mention. They did, in all of the marketing materials that went out, we voluntarily reduced our part of the capital improvement tax from 20% to 10%. So with those two things, the general fund subsidy and The capital improvement sales tax over that 18-year period, that's about $30 million that has been back into the general fund, not including any inflation dollars or anything, so.
Could I
Kroll?
follow up on a response to Councilmember Weissman? The other piece of that cost question would be that I would assume, but it's an assumption nonetheless, that the other funds would help participate in funding that study.
Or we would just charge them for it. No, I'm kidding. With the admin chargeback. Well,
Well, and
Councilman Kavanaugh.
And I know that you had sent out an email about an hour or two ago, as far as utilizing, I think, Columbia's method. Is that correct?
Well, I just gave that for information. I wouldn't necessarily recommend that.
Because I do know that Columbia does allocate out of their general fund like $4 million to the parks.
They've got internal service funds though too, which is a big deal. So yeah, I wasn't recommending that. I was showing that as an example where there are a lot of cities that have an administrative service fund calculated in many different ways.
Yeah.
Trust me on that.
Yeah.
I can assure you of that.
Okay.
Other committee discussion on this point? I'm just curious, Mr. Spalding, the history, being what it was over the last 16 years or so, where we are today, though, as we're discussing reviewing and streamlining and potentially making uniform how we calculate and apply these fees, is there really a reason anymore to continue treating parks differently than the other funds when it comes to the admin chargeback?
Is there a reason? Well, I'm biased, so I would say yes. I think when we study the Parks Department and try to understand what the Parks Department does as far as quality of life things, economic impact things, I think, when this first came up a couple of weeks ago, what I tried to do is, like I always try to do, I think, is look at it objectively and look at what other cities are doing and why they're doing it, right? So I chose the 6 cities above us in population and 6 cities below us in population. And I also tried to choose, Columbia gets compared to what we do a lot, right, when we do different things, and I chose Cape Girardeau, St. Joseph, and some cities that kind of are outliers, similar in size, kind of away from big cities sort of thing, so I wouldn't cherry pick my information. And it was interesting because Columbia charges a lot. They have an incredibly elaborate system of administrative chargebacks to all cities, and those numbers are switched back and forth. Not only does Columbia get dedicated park sales tax, they get huge general fund subsidies. They have other types of funds. They do special revenue funds if they're building a community center or something, and so that's very different. Some cities don't charge anything. Half of the cities didn't charge anything because there's a mindset of parks is a department that's unique in the fact that, for example, this year we're bringing in $5 million of economic impact to the community. That's $140,000 direct into the city's general fund and sales tax revenue. So I think there's a lot of reasons why. My point when the first day I got here was just to have the conversation of what does it really cost to run a park department if we're charging based on an expense, which, by the way, none of the 12 that I called directly to and their finance directors charged on a basis of percentage of expenses, not one. And so how do we find out how much it costs to run our department? And that's really the conversation I'd like to have, because if we're a burden in certain areas like IT or other things, would it be better that we don't get charged that and we have our own IT, whether it's a contractor or employee, that can focus directly on our needs all the time, right? We have an amphitheater, we have an ice arena, we have all these things. Does it make sense for somebody at City Hall to have to deal with all that, right? So I think and the thing I kept getting told was, well, if we really looked into that, you'd be paying a lot more. And my response to that quite clearly and publicly is, well, then we need to talk about that. So I think, should we be charged differently? I think we should be charged what we use. Yes.
Mr. Spalding mentioned the percentage of expenses, and again, that's the approach applied to which group of funds? Is that the approach applied to the?
That is the approach that we apply to all funds as we initially start the process. Parks then has a variance, so I know exactly how much that percentage is and what the calculation would be if we treated parks the same versus the way we are currently treating them. And then there are some additional costs that are passed on to wastewater and parking due to the fact that we have some additional staff that do a vast majority of things for parking, and wastewater has bonds, and there is a substantial amount of work that goes along with those bonds.
Yeah. And then again,
But everyone is calculated in the same way to start the process,
and then the adjustment for parks again is
taken off of what that calculation would be.
okay. To where the net effect is. a
The
certain-
parks calculation ends up being 5% of what their total sales tax collections were for a 12-month period.
Okay, so you know what the.
I know what the
You know-
calculation would be.
You know what it would be.
Yes,
And then we sort of put that aside and then do 5%
yes.
of their collections. Okay. Other discussion on this point? Okay, Councilman Spencer?
I guess the lesson learned here is that documentation and historical significance matter. And whenever a council is not allowed to participate in a policy-making decision, it has a huge ripple effect. And, unfortunately, the mayor at the time did that without any council participation, and that's disappointing. And I think we do have an obligation to correct that here going forward. And whatever that looks like, I hope we can have a real in-depth dialogue about that. And so I know people don't like it that I bring it up second year in a row of doing this, but I think it's important that we get it right from here on out. And we can do that. So, thank you.
Thanks. I know in the past, I believe you presented last year on the same topic, and I think maybe part of the argument or the rationale was some sort of offsetting, I think mainly tree trimming services provided by parks employees. Is that still part of the formula here?
Sure,
In
it
terms of
absolutely is.
consideration?
You bet. And frankly, with the chargeback, yes, the costs are more prohibitive than that. We, through our own funds and through our own manpower, take care of trees, take care of the areas that are common areas that need to be beautified.
So I think last year there was a value estimate provided to us, but it was, I mean,
Yeah, I think
it was considerably, less than what the opposing benefit to parks is by having a special calculation in this way, if my
Yeah.
recollection serves.
Yeah, 20 years ago, or so, when the city wanted to become a Tree City USA, I think it's been about 20 years, in order to do that, there had to be certain things put in place. And one of the things that was put in place was the Parks Department would house and pay for the city forester. That city forester is responsible, in a short and concise definition, for every tree within the city. So if a homeowner calls and said, this tree's over on my neighbor's yard, it's infringing on that, they have to go and make the determination or whatever. If a right-of-way tree we have to go and clean it up. And we document that fee every time we do that. And that ranges all over the place. We get $25,000 right now from the city general fund, which, interestingly enough, the charter states, and that anything that's not park related, we are responsible for the salary of the forester, but anything not parks related is supposed to be paid for by the general fund. That simply doesn't happen now. We get a set fee, and we do beyond that number of work. That number we get 25,000, that number ranges anywhere from 75 to 125 pretty easily every year.
Mr. Kroll?
And my response would I think that's part of what an analysis would look at, or what are the different services, and back and forth, and, you know, identify those and put some costs on them. And
So if we engaged a consultant, could they just look at parks part of this?
I think it needs to be, they could. I think they could look at the parks and from my point of view, and they may have a different point of view, look at parks and the general fund contributions and what some other, I'm going to say departments, but funds do, snow removal, for example. I think if we're going to do it, it seems to me to make sense to let's get the whole formula figured out, get all of that identified, and then you all make some decisions about, and I'm sure there will be options, you know, some different options, but it's an expensive process.
And we won't have an answer in the next few weeks.
And it'll be a while, you're right, yes. Yeah.
But
Yeah, you may get cars before you
do-
get an answer.
Yeah, but I think that's, it seems like that's the only way this is going to get really resolved, to me.
I think so.
I agree. Councilman Spencer?
Just to follow up, is there any kind of data that supports, in your looking at other methodologies of other communities possibly, or even Mr. Spalding, to have a inflationary mechanism in that too? Because, I mean, we are in extraordinary times here, 40-year inflation. I'm sure a lot of these methodologies didn't take that into account because it just has been so well controlled.
I
So-
think it would really depend on the methodology that you choose to use as to whether or not an inflationary factor would play into that as you progress.
Because, I mean, the argument of you know, outsourcing versus doing it internally, I mean, inflationary costs have to be a part of that discussion, so, to
Yeah.
get a realistic number.
There's also the practical piece of it, though, too. I mean, you know, IT, for example. Well, if you're going to contract that out, but we're still going to allow them to connect to our system, I think there's some issues there. Legal, but there may be others that are not. You know, cutting trees may be one of those. So. It's something to look at. I think we probably have outgrown, as I said, I think we probably have outgrown that methodology. It's probably good at one time, but I think we've outgrown it just in complexity and size. And I think it deserves a good, hard, independent look, albeit expensive and time-consuming.
Yeah, and it will also be a process that goes beyond the scope and time frame of this committee's work this year. So it would be helpful if, going forward and very soon, we begin trying to line up service providers for that, and then sort of honing a scope of what they'd be looking at, and trying to assess what the cost of that would be. But in the full council context and not in the context of this committee, I think. Other discussion on this particular point for tonight? I suspect we'll probably come back to it before the end of this committee's work, if only for additional conversation. Councilman Kemna?
Just curious, I mean, as far as funding a study, I mean, is there various ways that we could do that? Is it most likely a general fund? I mean, that's not something that we could tag to any kind of like sales tax, or, I mean, we don't have any ARPA funds really anymore for that. But I was just curious, like, if we wanted to go that direction, what's the most logical way of funding that study?
Well,
you said all departments should be engaged.
I said all funds.
All funds,
The
okay.
funds. So
Okay.
wastewater, parking, transit, and airport don't really matter, and I think parks ought to be involved in that as well. So you know how you divide that, I don't know. I mean, it could be, you know, there's different ways you can get formulas on that. We can come up with something. depends on what the estimate of the study would be, and I just don't know what that would be.
Thank you. Further discussion, Councilman
To
Deacon.
piggyback on Councilman Kimna, we're just discussing, if we don't figure out when are we gonna do it, let's fund it if we're gonna do it, unless next year, well, we're still talking about, we're gonna have to figure out, you know, the particulars, where we're gonna find the funding, are we gonna do it this year, try to find it? I'm new to it, but, yeah, you're right, we gotta do it sometime. Too many councils have kicked it down.
So with ARPA, didn't we say there's still about 40,000?
Yes.
thought
I think
we-
we started somewhere around 70, then we did 35, then we did 30, so.
Okay, I thought,
Probably we should be somewhere around 35, 40 or something.
okay, just wanted to make sure, because I
Yeah.
thought we were closer to 45 when we started, so, okay, thank you.
Okay, additional discussion tonight on this topic. Seeing none, any additional topics of conversation that the committee would like to bring?
So I just want to bring this up. We haven't talked about it. I don't see how we can do this budget without talking about it, and that is about dealing with the compression issue. I know within the original mayor's budget, there was a 2% pool. And of course, that's across a number of the, not just the general fund, but a number of the funds. We don't have the study yet, but I guess we'll get some information. But we know it's going to cost us, and I would anticipate it'll be at least 2%. And if we don't do at least 2% in this process, I think we're really being neglectful and not doing really what we need to do in the budget process. So up on the board is presented, you know, what the different amounts would be needed to fund at that 2% pool to address the compression issues. I mean, this is an issue that has plagued us for many years, and it's going to continue that unless we deal with it. And I think this issue is much more important than some of the things that we were talking about funding and have talked about funding recently. So anyway, for the general fund itself, with the general fund amount needed and the subsidies needed for airport and transit, it's just under $200,000. It's $193,000 basically that we'd be talking about. But anyway, I do think it's just something we need to talk about and try to find the money to fund it. That's for tonight. That's all I want to say.
Okay, thank you. Any other discussion, any response to that point or discussion about it, Councilman Spencer?
I agree, Councilman Lester, and I mean, there was a formula, there was a kind of a roadmap from the 2016 Austin Peters study, and that wasn't implemented then. But I definitely feel more comfortable with trying to lay out a plan, but after we get the Evergreen updated numbers. But I'm committed with you to work on this and address it, because I think it's needed. So, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any other discussion on that point? I'll ask if there's anyone here for public comment, and it does not appear that there is. So other topics of discussion, Ms. Perry?
So we do still have one thing on the general fund parking lot and the public safety tax. They're tied together. It's the Juneteenth holiday and the health and dental increases that were included in public safety, where it was requested that those be moved off. If the committee is not going to vote on that tonight, I would just ask if it's okay for us to leave it on the parking lot for further discussion.
Please do.
Thank you.
Okay, other discussion tonight on other topics or following up on topics we've already discussed. Councilman Spencer.
Sorry, was there going to be some information given on pension cost? I thought that was something that we had asked for at the previous meeting.
So I have done some research on loggers, and the first thing that I want to point out that we pulled is the ordinance where it was approved for the fire pension to move into loggers. So that was done in 2016 after it passed through legislation, and I do have a ordinance number on that if anyone's interested in it. It's 15640. And I went back and have pulled the data out for what the pension contributions are starting November 1st of 22. For general employees, which also includes 911, any non-FOP personnel, it's 12.8%. For police, it's 18%, and for fire, it's 50%. With fire, I'd also like to point out that Councilman Hensley had asked if there was a capped contribution rate, and the rate for this time frame was computed to be 55.6%. The agreement with loggers basically stipulates that the rate can increase on any of these particular groupings, divisions, 1% per year. So 55.6 is what it was calculated at for the November 1st of 2022. Although they call it a cap, it's a little unusual because they can recalculate that dollar amount or that cap percentage each year. And it could change if there are increases due to actuarial losses. So I also currently have what would be effective in fiscal year 24. So we are talking another year out. Both the general fund and the police department rate decreased by 1%, so 11.8% and 17%, and the fire percentage again increases to 51%, and the cap has gone from 55.6% to 56%. So I guess to point out what that means, for every dollar of salary that you pay to fire personnel, you're also paying 50 cents for retirement contributions. For every dollar that you pay to police personnel, you're paying 18 cents additional for retirement. And for every general employee, $1 paid in salary, you're paying 12.8 cents. So I'm not really sure what other kind of information you'd like me to provide.
But you are forgetting the Social Security contribution for all those employee groups.
Correct.
So if you wanna call
So
it-
fire with Social Security
Is none.
they're still associated with the, there's a 7.2% and a 1.45% Social Security and Medicare. We have to pay for a fire employee the 1.45%. So there is not the 6.2% contribution for Social Security as well. That gets taken into account there.
What I'm going to call the old pension plan.
And I was going to say it's strictly, the rate is due to the unfunded liability, as you said earlier, from a long time ago, prior to anyone sitting in these chairs. When it was approved to move over, that went through legislation, and then it was approved by the council at the time to move that into loggers, with the understanding that there was going to be a significant amount of unfunded liability that would be associated with the rate. And that's what we are still attempting to recover from.
But there will be a tipping point where that gap is closed. Now, that might be 20 to 25 years down the road, but we will have that tipping point.
At some point.
Yeah. And for clarification too, what I'm going to call the old fireman's pension plan that was strictly funded through property tax before we got into loggers. There is still a fund there, and once all those members have passed away, then there's some significant dollars that can be used to shore up some of that unfunded liability, is what I hope is the plan.
Sure, if it was related to property tax, which I know is a true statement, we still get property tax that's designated as fire pension, but that is, at this point, being utilized for the individuals that were in the plan the old plan, as you call it.
Yeah.
But that property tax will remain there.
And to
For
make
use.
sure that we don't have another episode of like what we have with the parks admin fees, I would like for us to really focus on what that long-term strategy and commitment is, because that, from my understanding, that has not been ordinanced out, if you will, of where those dollars will go once the old pension plan is ceased to exist anymore.
Good
Because there'll
question.
be asset dollars left within that pension plan.
But those dollars were transitioned to the loggers plan, the dollars that were in the old plan
For them to administer.
were transitioned to loggers and became part of the pool of assets that the city holds with loggers, and were utilized to come up with the percentage of contribution on an annual basis. So those are sitting with loggers. They are not sitting with the city in any way. They're with loggers.
Yeah, because loggers is administering that
Correct.
pension plan. So,
And any dollars that we currently receive on property tax are designated for fire retirement. And regardless at this point of how you look at it, it's not enough to cover the old plan, and it's not enough to cover the contributions that are made on new members.
Now, I think it's obvious, but the number that Sheila was mentioning comes from loggers. It's not a number that we pick or negotiate or anything like that. They say, here's the unfunded liability, and this is your numbers.
And that's true across all three divisions, whether that's general, police, or fire. That is the number provided to them as to what the contributions need to be for the coming 12-month cycle.
Great, thank you. Any other discussion on this point for this evening? Seeing none, I'll just remind everyone that our next meeting will be this Thursday evening, the 15th, at 5:30. And then we have a city council meeting next Monday, the 19th, at 6. And then the next budget meeting after that will be next Thursday, September 22nd at 5:30 in this room. Any other points of discussion for tonight? Councilman Spencer.
sorry, just real quick, do we have any anticipated date of when Evergreen's coming?
Gail had actually a conversation with them on Friday and today, actually. They're working on getting the data correct and then make their recommendations from that, and it's taken a little bit longer than we like. So I don't have, I haven't had a chance to speak with Gail on that particular point.
Great, thank you. Any other discussion for tonight? Seeing none, I'll call us adjourned and see everyone next time. Thank you.